Well, welcome everybody to our discussion evening tonight. And particularly we welcome Annette Lowe, who's going to give us a talk on Jung and Swedenborg. And that's going to be of particular interest for most of us online, I think, at the moment. But I should just introduce Annette. Although you've probably already read the information that we sent out, but Annette is a Jungian analyst, been so for 25 years, I think it is, and has her own practice in St Kilda, been president of the Jung Society in Melbourne, and trained in the Jung Institute in Zurich. Very nice place to be able to do your training. But we certainly welcome you very, very happily and well tonight, and we look forward to what you've got to say. So without further ado, hand over the meeting to you then, Annette.
Thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, that preparing this talk has given me the opportunity to find out something about Swedenborg and to find out more about Jung. It's been a fascinating bit of research for me. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. My first point is that Swedenborg had a lifelong influence on Jung, and this I was surprised to discover. I'm going to show you the young Jung. Ori Ellenberger wrote a classic book called The History of the Unconscious, and he devoted a chapter to Jung. He writes of Jung, he was passionately interested in such authors as Swedenborg, Mesmer, and he lists a few more that I haven't heard of. The author Ellenberger went back to the records of the University Student Society at which Jung spoke in discussions when he was a medical student. Ellenberger writes, this allows us to trace the origin of several of the basic concepts of analytical psychology to this early period. And I think this indicates that Jung's early thinking in psychology would have been influenced by what he read of Swedenborg. In a book by the Australian Philip Groves called Swedenborg's Mighty Contribution to the Welfare of the Soul, after the foreword, there are several quotes. One from Jung is dated 1957, but there's no mention of where the quote comes from, I'm afraid. The quote is this: I admire Swedenborg as a great scientist and a great mystic at the same time. This was Jung speaking. Now, you could describe Jung as both a scientist and a mystic too. And Groves also says that while still a medical student, Carl Jung made a study of arcana. Now, I don't know how to pronounce this. Caelestia?
Arcana Celestia.
Celestia, okay. Arcana Celestia. And he read the major part of that work. Now, if you have a nature or a mind that's both scientific and mystical, I think you're a rare bird. If you find a writer who sees the world as you do, who shares and clarifies your own perspective, it's an exciting discovery, isn't it, as a young person? Hooray, there's something like me out there in the world. That writer is going to leave a deep impression on you and influence your thinking. And I think that's what happened between Swedenborg and Jung. I understand that in Arcana Celestia, Swedenborg writes about life after death. Jung's memoirs devote a whole chapter to exactly this. The chapter's called Life After Death. And at the start of the chapter, he writes, my works are fundamentally nothing but attempts, ever renewed, to give an answer to the question of the interplay between the here and the hereafter. Now, this shows, I think, just how deep an impression Arcana Celestia left upon Jung. The book shaped the fundamental questions that Jung explored throughout his life. In the era when Jung was training in medicine, students had to write a thesis for their final exams. Jung wrote about a cousin who was a medium. he tried to explain the phenomenon rationally. But it does show that Jung was interested both in science and in the world beyond science. On the other hand, he had to earn a living, so he made a compromise and studied psychiatry. So Jung began his career knowing that humans have a link to the hereafter, the beyond, the transpersonal, to God, whatever you want to call it. One great difference between Swedenborg and Jung, though, the biggest one that I see, is that by Jung's time, the existence of the unconscious mind had been acknowledged, and psychiatry in his day was focusing on exploring the unconscious. Jung's concept of the human psyche therefore included the unconscious, whereas Swedenborg's obviously couldn't. By psyche, I should say, I mean human mentality as a whole, both conscious and unconscious aspects. In his writing, Jung chose to explain that link to the transpersonal and to explain mystical and visionary phenomena in psychological terms. As I said in my abstract, Jung's is the only psychiatry that does not exclude spirituality, psychology, I beg your pardon, that does not exclude spirituality or religion from its description of the human psyche. His psychological ideas can always be understood from a spiritual perspective too, which I'm going to try and illustrate. Now, my next point is that the deep imagination mirrors the divine world. I would say that Swedenborg gave Jung something more. Henri Corbin explained Swedenborg's concepts of representations and correspondences. It was helpful to me to understand Swedenborg's view that the spiritual world is distinct from the natural world, and that the things which are diffused throughout the natural world from the spiritual world are representations of spiritual things. They are given this name because they represent the latter, and they represent them because they correspond to them. This is a quote. Specifically, the things diffused through the natural world are an allegory for spiritual things. Corbin argues for the reality, or perhaps validity, of the deep imagination. And I don't mean by that just fantasies and daydreams. Corbin argues an image appears in a mirror. The material of the mirror is not the material substance of the image. It's simply the place of its appearance. Similarly, the deep imagination is the mirror for images of the spiritual world. The imagination translates spiritual states into vision events within the imagination. Well, Corbin is just rephrasing Swedenborg's idea of representations, I understand. With the implicit encouragement of Swedenborg, Jung then was able to accept his own deep visions as absolutely valid. Jung trusted his deep imagination and trusted that it mirrored the divine world. Most of the ideas that later formed Jung's analytical psychology germinated from his contact with this imaginal reality, as I'm going to illustrate shortly. He completely accepted, eventually, that the images he saw imaginatively were manifestations of spirit. He even believed that the characters he met in his deep imagination could be the actual spirits of, the spirits of actual departed people, but not without a terrible panic first. In late 1913, now that is the old Jung, chopping wood.
Oh, look at that.
And this is 1913. At this stage, Jung was 38. Jung had a repeated vision of a black tide of destruction and death sweeping over Europe. At first, he interpreted the vision psychologically and was terrified that the black tide represented a psychosis that would soon overwhelm him. And this was an image he painted of that vision. Well, when World War I broke out in the next year, Jung realized with great relief that it was a prophetic vision that he'd had. It was a phenomenon from the spiritual world that was about to be mirrored in the material world. I hope that's an example of both representation and correspondence.
Yeah.
In any case, I imagine that Jung would have been enormously relieved to remember Swedenborg's descriptions. Someone else had experienced something similar, could describe what had happened, and had come through the experience perfectly well. Jung had now good proof of Swedenborg's ideas. It gave Jung confidence in the validity of the deep imagination and gave him the desire to explore it further over the next 3 or 4 years as he grappled with his midlife crisis. Yeah. I always like to say Jung had the first midlife crisis. Jung understood that imagination conveys a form of truth to consciousness that cannot be conveyed in any other way. Mystical truth has to clothe itself in symbolic imagery in order to reach consciousness because it's so abstract. Jung's record of his explorations was the Red Book, which perhaps you've heard of. There is a famous quote about the importance of these years for Jung, and it comes from his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. Okay, now I'm going to gallop through an explanation of some relevant Jungian concepts. I'll just ask quickly whether everyone is happy with what I've said. Is it clear so far?
Yes.
Anyone not clear? No. Okay, good. So I will put this up. So this is a map in inverted commas of the psyche, and it's in inverted commas because the psyche isn't as tidy as this. This is just to help understand Jung's concept of the human psyche. Right, persona, our social mask, good manners, the fact that we are polite to others, and so on. Ego, obviously, the center of consciousness. Our reality function. Make sure I have my notes in the right order, that I turned up on time, and so on. Shadow, everything we don't like to know about ourselves. So I like to think of myself as a nice person, and all my nasty bits that I don't want to know about, I'll hide away from myself in shadow. Now, this is the important bit for our purposes, the unconscious. Jung made a distinction between the personal and the collective unconscious. Personal, collective, they kind of fade into one another. My personal unconscious contains everything in my inner and outer experience that I've either pushed out of consciousness because it's uncomfortable, or that I've simply forgotten. Now, that's not just things that happen to me, but my emotional reactions, perceptions, and so forth. Jung also described the collective unconscious, a deeper layer which is common to all humanity. There are patterns in common across unrelated cultures around the world, for example, that suggest a basic layer of the psyche that all humans have in common. Jung also declared that the most basic urge in humanity was the religious urge, the desire to find a transcendental meaning to our lives. Freud, by contrast, claimed that the most basic urge was sex, and he didn't go past the personal level of the unconscious. Now, if you believe in any higher power at all, you believe that it's collective. You believe that it influences everyone and everything, whether or not the individual acknowledges the existence of such a power. So the collective unconscious was a space for transcendental energies. Other psychologies don't include this collective region, and that's why I say Jung's psychology is the only one that doesn't exclude spirituality or religion from its description. Okay, so going down to the bottom, the central focus of the collective unconscious is the self. The self actually stands beyond the individual personality. It's part of the collective level, as I say. It's got two aspects. One faces towards the transpersonal realm, to God, and the other faces towards the individual personality. A quote, Swedenborg presumes a divine center of the universe from which flow all creative forces. This is Sinnesvet, who wrote this. Now, I hope you can see how similar the two concepts are. To use a metaphor, the electricity that comes from power stations is thousands of volts strong. It has to be broken down to the 240 volts that we use in our domestic appliances. Well, that's kind of what the self does. It breaks down the transpersonal energy into levels of energy that the individual human personality can possibly assimilate. And I'll go more into the assimilation process in a bit. The self contains, according to Jung, the blueprint for the development of the personality through life. It's something like the DNA of personality development. The self uses those divine energies it receives in accordance with the blueprint. The self's aim is to develop the personality as much as possible and bring as much as possible of the personality into manifestation in the outer world throughout your life. I'll come back to this in a minute. Is this clear? Is that any questions on that one?
No.
No, good, okay. First though, I've got to say a word about archetypes. Now, you may already know of the mother and father archetypes, the hero archetype, and so on. Divine energy from the self is distributed to chosen archetypes and becomes archetypal energy. And this is one stage in its translation down to human levels. As the master archetype, the self influences all other archetypes in pursuit of its aims of developing the personality. It may develop one archetype or it may activate, I beg your pardon, one archetype at a particular moment or switch off another. For example, if consciousness becomes too rigid in its views, the self may activate the trickster archetype to force change or even revolution, because that's what the trickster archetype does. It breaks up a static situation in order to enable change. Of course, the self employs many other archetypes as well. The mother and father archetypes are particularly powerful because of our early experience of them. And images of these archetypes will nearly always produce an emotional response in us, whether negative or positive. Now, the continuous flow of archetypal energy into the personality gently fosters our inner psychological and spiritual development throughout life. Sometimes the workings of this energy are imaged in our dreams. Archetypes are also the ground of our personality, and our personality is based on a selection of individual archetypes. I think my mother archetype is not very strong. I've never wanted children. But on the other hand, I think the Mercury or Hermes archetype is strong in me. Mercury was the messenger of the gods. He zipped around between the heights of Mount Olympus, or Hermes anyway, and the depths of Hades and back again. I love travel. I love driving. I did languages at school. I love reading. And now I do talk therapy all day. But Mercury or Hermes was also the god of cooks, tailors, and thieves. And in none of these areas have I the slightest talent. So I guess I don't completely embody the archetype, but it is an element of my personality. So it's archetypes form a very basic ground of the personality, but as well, some can get temporarily switched on or off during the course of your development. The self's influence on our individual personality is ultimately a process of psychological healing, renewal, and enlargement of the personality towards wholeness. Life can wound us, of course, and set up blockages to this flow of the self's energy. I'll talk about blocking complexes later. The self gently prods us to become aware of our wounds, to acknowledge our shadow, both of which can often make us behave badly in the world. And the self gently prods us to do something about them. Here's an implicit spiritual or moral perspective in Jung's psychology. Enlargement of the personality is about developing and using our potentials and talents, making the best use of myself while I'm on the planet. And not just to be a rugged individualist, but to become a solid, reliable jigsaw piece in the cosmic order. This is individuation. Jung's concept of the process, individuation is Jung's concept of the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity. From this firm ground, you come to know yourself well, including your failings, your shadow. You, ego you, listen to what the unconscious has to tell you in both psychological and spiritual terms. This contrasts with the person who's identified with the group, goes with the herd, and has a group personality. Listening to the promptings of the unconscious, the insights and intuitions that it brings, accepting and absorbing them, makes our conscious personality more like the blueprint that the self holds for us. As Jung says, the more numerous and more significant the unconscious contents, which are assimilated to the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self, even though this approximation must be a never-ending process. Jung's aim in writing was to describe factors in common across people's inner experience, which is, of course, spiritual experience. I've relied a lot on what follows on a book by Lionel Corbett called The Religious Function of the Psyche. It's the only book I know that takes a purely spiritual perspective to Jung's work. Excuse me a moment. So with the help of Lionel Corbett, let's rephrase these concepts of self, archetype, and individuation from a more spiritual perspective. I see Wayne looking a wee bit puzzled. Has anybody got any questions, or it's not clear so far? No, you're fine, Wayne, good. Okay. I've said the self is transpersonal, and that one aspect looks out into the cosmos, receives divine energy. The other aspect connects to the individual personality via the archetypes. So the archetypes are manifestation of divine energy. Divine or spiritual energy flows down through the archetypes towards individual consciousness. Jung suggested that archetypal levels of the psyche provide experience which is synonymous with what has always been considered the religious domain. A favorite Jungian word is numinous, which, in case you don't use it, just means religious or spiritual. Corbett quotes from a letter of Jung's of 1945, in which he says, "The main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neuroses, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact is that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy, and inasmuch as you attain to the numinous, you are released from the curse of pathology." Well, that is a pretty close parallel and equation of psychological and spiritual, is it not? The psychological healing and development that Jung calls individuation is exactly the same as spiritual development, in which we become more and more our authentic selves, more and more the building block in the cosmos that we are intended to be. Then we may be, as Swedenborg says, of use within the cosmos. I should emphasize that individuation is not something we choose to do, it happens to us. Basically, you will individuate or make a step forward in individuation when God, the self, says you can, so to speak. Share screen. And I found this when the time was right. I was away traveling and just happened to see this when I was thinking pretty much exactly that. Right. So the process of individuation is also affected by the ego, by how much inner change the ego can cope with at a particular time. The ego has a drive to create stability, to know and understand the local world around us. Then the ego can function effectively to manage our day-to-day lives. Sometimes an insecure ego finds the changes that the self brings to be too terrifying or overwhelming. It resists those changes, defends furiously against them. And then the ego is in conflict with the self. and there's psychological trouble ahead when that happens. So one aspect of individuation is to discipline ourselves to be receptive to, rather than frightened of inner change and the promptings of the unconscious. So one element in the process of individuation is the development of an ego that is receptive to the unconscious, as I say, which allows the archetypes to do their work within our psyches. Another element in individuation is the development of soul. And soul, of course, means different things to different people. Here's Corbett's view. The self gradually unfolds into earthly reality by a process of incarnation or embodiment. That is, it moves from potential or spirit into body and behavior lived out in the world. In this way, the self, Jungian self, acts as a template or blueprint for the development of the subjective experience of being or possessing a personal self or soul. Again, when spirit or archetype embodies, it takes on a personally meaningful quality, which we call soul. Soul receives transpersonal spirit and enables consciousness to grasp spirit on a personal level and allows more of the self to embody. Right. Are we all holding together so far? Is this all okay so far?
Yep. Think so.
Good. Okay. I think I can stop the share. I want to move on to a discussion of good and evil from a Jungian perspective. As the author Johnson says, Swedenborg requires that people search their souls for their innermost motives, and that they then consciously and actively combat all the evil revealed by their self-analysis. Well, as a Jungian, I obviously think a more psychological perspective can get us further than the traditional Christian beliefs that were Jung, that Swedenborg based his ideas on. Swedenborg will have absorbed Christian ideologies, of course, before the birth of psychology. As we all are, Swedenborg was a prisoner of his era. It's not about being perfect for Jung. He advocated authenticity. And the ideal of individuation is about being authentic to the spiritual energies that flow through us. And sooner or later, that will involve a confrontation with our inner wounds and conflicts. I'm going to try and explain how those inner wounds and conflicts can be the source of evil that we may do. So I've got to backtrack a bit to some more Jungian concepts. We're back with archetypes again. I've mentioned two functions of archetypes. One, that they're a pipeline of spiritual energy from the self into the individual personality as a stimulus to inner development. And I said also that in the individual, certain archetypes may be permanently switched on from birth and shape our basic personality. Now, being a communicator, I was good at languages at school, and fortunately, I was able to study languages at school and university. I was able to clothe that archetypal energy in outer experience, to live out the archetypal energy in my conscious life. I was fortunate though, and it isn't always that easy. What if I'd had the nastiest French teacher in the world? I would have had a very negative experience of languages and communication, a negative experience of the archetype. Now, I'm going to switch to a better example, the trickster, because it's a universal archetype. It's a potential in everyone. Generally speaking, the archetypal potential of the trickster, as I've said, is to break down the prevailing order when the prevailing order has become too rigid. The earthly manifestation in consciousness of the trickster, our individual image of the trickster, is seen, in part at least, in our attitude towards the unexpected. For a new baby, the unexpected is probably unpleasant, and it usually makes babies cry. But when mother plays the old game of peekaboo with it, it may learn that the unexpected reappearance of mum saying peekaboo, it may learn that the unexpected can also be fun. Well, as adults, peekaboo is no longer interesting, but the trickster can be fun when it comes in the shape of a clown or a comedian or a cartoonist. Sorry. That's the trickster. Okay. A few people are smiling or even laughing. What about this one? Now there's a trickster mind.
Oh, yes.
That's funny.
The humor of trickster types who invented this image usually comes from doing or saying the unexpected. And there's something unexpected in that image, obviously. And we enjoy it because of our early experiences. However, the earthly experience we accumulate around an archetype will have positive or negative aspects. If your earliest memory is traumatic, for example, seeing the footage of planes flying into the Twin Towers of New York, that's a very different trickster experience. You'll tend to fear the unexpected. The trickster archetype, archetypes help us to categorize events into meaningful groups and give them a positive or negative evaluation. The trickster archetype helps us to recognize unexpected events, and then we can categorize them as positive or negative, fun or terrifying. This introduces one more concept, and I'll give you another example. Imagine if some trickster type of person, let's say it's another kid at school, keeps making jokes at my expense, keeps making fun of me. I'm going to develop a particular personal response to fun trickster experiences. I may be wary, sensitive, and cautious about whether it's really fun or not. I'll be easily offended. Some of the more anarchic comedians may not be to my taste. I have a personal complex. Come on. Thank you. Now, complexes is the concept I want to introduce. My complex is triggered when someone or something presses my button. Something offends my sensitivities, or I perceive, rightly or wrongly, that someone is making fun of me. That person has evoked the trickster archetype in the unconscious. But my accumulated conscious trickster experience in these unpleasant school situations has been very negative. I have a negative trickster complex. Which is underpinned by the trickster archetype and fleshed out through my personal experience. In Jungian terms, the definition, a complex is a set of feeling tone thoughts with my sensitivities, my memories of being made fun of, my resentment, clustered around an archetypal core, the trickster archetype. And if I think that someone is even thinking about making fun of me, my complex will be activated and I will react disproportionately because it's the energy, the powerful energy of the trickster driving me. It's not just a normal reaction. There's all that pent-up energy behind my reaction. That's how you know a complex has been activated. My reactions may be intense, hypersensitive, and disproportionate, as I say. My complex has distorted my perception of reality at that moment. Now, imagine how much more powerful the mother and father archetypes are. We experience them very intensely at the start of life. Even if you never know your biological parents, there'll be someone who clothed your parental archetypes in actual experience. Our mother and father complexes will be very intense. Ask any teenager who's trying to deal with those complexes and separate from their influence. We all have complexes, big ones and little ones. For as long as we're alive, we'll have complexes of one sort or another. They may be painful, formed through some kind of bad experience, or they may be positive, formed through some sort of particularly good experiences. Some are big and associated with strong and deep emotions. Quite a few of our biggest ones may be associated with parents. A positive mother complex, mum always looks after me. A negative mother complex, she was so cold she couldn't care less. Similar with dad, he was always around to show me how to sort things out, versus dad was such a dictator. A smaller complex. We always had fox terriers when I was a kid, and I still just love them when I see them. You've got a very small, positive fox terrier complex. Likewise, I've never liked fox terriers because one bit me when I was 4 years old, and I never feel comfortable around them. The point about complexes is that when they're triggered, they distort our perceptions of what's happening in front of us. This is exactly where evil can arise. For a very small example, let's say a young woman with a negative mother complex is working alongside an older woman. The young one believes the older one is so cold she couldn't care less. She projects the image of her own negative mother onto the older woman. In fact, the older woman is terribly shy and terrified of the younger one. You can see how misunderstanding and conflict could arise. So, by becoming aware of our complex, we gain a much more balanced approach to the world. On the spiritual level, we cause less pain to others and can be a more positive influence. We're slowly working towards a Jungian exploration of the psychological origins of evil. I'm saying it has a lot to do with complexes, obviously. If we take the example of the mother complex again and go a bit deeper, What happens when the earthly mother is depressed or drug addicted, neglectful or preoccupied? The quantity of spiritual energy is blocked by the negativity and by the complex that develops. That quantity of spiritual energy cannot incarnate in the child, and it tends to turn dark and negative. Likewise, if a mother is overly protective due to her own anxieties or possessive of the child due to her own emotional need, the child's archetypal pattern of development away from mother and towards greater independence is blocked and frustrated. Again, the archetypal energy turns dark and negative. As Corbett says, material which is too affectively painful cannot embody, so that in such cases, a piece of the child's soul remains split off or repressed. Part of the personality remains incompletely formed and repressed into shadow. Now, no mother or father is perfect, and it's inevitable that some parts of our potential will remain split off or repressed. And that emotional response to archetypal frustration triggers the formation of a complex, which distorts our perception of the reality around us. Complexes can be very painful and can damage the course of your life. Some examples of attitudes shaped by complexes: I am not worthy enough to find a girlfriend or boyfriend, so I suffer loneliness. I don't trust authority, so I'll rebel against society. And I won't be able to fulfill myself in a career. If the pain is so unbearable, we have to shut it out of consciousness. We may cultivate an attitude that compensates. So if I feel too unworthy to find a boyfriend, or if a young man considers himself too unworthy to find a girlfriend, he may cultivate a contempt for women. That's what I mean by compensation. And that can be painful and damaging to the women he meets. The inferiority complex is still unconsciously driving that person's attitudes and behavior, but their perception of reality is distorted. Now, such unbalanced perceptions and behavior can be very dangerous indeed. I'll start with the archetype of purity. Now, sacred purity is an archetypal idea. You wash your hands and feet before going into a mosque. You do the same if you go into a Japanese Shinto shrine. We have baptism, that in a pure state you enter the church or become a member of the church. So purity is actually an archetypal idea. Now, onto that, you can build the ideology of racial purity. I wonder if you can see where I'm going. Such an ideology may fit in with an individual's fiercely emotional desire for superiority as a way of blocking out the pain of an inferiority complex. In the unconscious of that individual would be a sense that I'm not pure, I'm not adequate. A quantity of spiritual energy that would normally produce self-esteem has not incarnated. It's turned dark and negative. Driven by an unconscious suppressed inferiority complex, the individual may enter a fierce and emotional battle for racial purity in their society. I don't think I need to remind you that Hitler's racial purity complex killed 6.25 million Jews, plus the physically handicapped, psychiatrically disturbed dissidents and gypsies. Now, that's an extreme example, but the frustration of archetypal energy can produce less profound evil in many ways. If our emotional response to the frustration of archetypal energy is unbearably painful, there's the danger of fragmentation or shattering of the ego. And that produces psychosis. Or only slightly less damaging personality disorders. Similarly, ideologies that proclaim a new world order may appeal because they offer the individual ego a symbol of controlling the unruly and painful unconscious. And this can extend to fundamentalism too. I hope this gives a bit of clarity on the Jungian view of the psychological origins of evil within the individual. I suppose the logical conclusion to what I've said is that for people who do evil, their own suffering is too much to bear, too much to deal with, and they almost can't help but pass it on to others. As I say, the Jungian view is that the self keeps on trying to loosen the ego's defenses against blocking complex, against the defensive unconscious, and resolve these sorts of things. Gradually, we hope that there's an erosion of the complex so that deeper self-esteem might get built, and little flashes of insight along the way. Eventually, you get to the point, we hope, of saying, oh, I don't need to behave like that anymore. I can do it differently. And that's the self has been working to prepare consciousness for this shift in attitude. So if we can get past the nonsense of our earthly conditioning, we can be who we were divinely and innately intended to be. If Swedenborg words it like this: the salvation of man is the continuous operation of the Lord with man from the first of his infancy even to the last of his life. Man's reformation and regeneration, thus his salvation, are all of the Lord's divine providence. Jung and Swedenborg here seem to be in full agreement. Now, I have loads more, but I have already taken up almost an hour of your time. So I wonder if you have any questions, comments, or any points that you would like to discuss.
Well, did Jung say anything about the influence of evil spirits on the human race?
Evil spirits?
Yeah.
Well, no, because he, at least on the surface, tried to keep it psychological. The spiritual interpretation is more implicit. He was trying to be scientific. He was trying to make his ideas as widely acceptable as possible.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Couldn't rock the boat.
Sorry?
He couldn't really rock the boat.
Not too much.
Talk about evil spirits when he's a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst.
Exactly.
You know, it's like crossing the border, so he had to keep quiet on that matter.
Yes.
Even though he'd read a lot of Swedenborg, it must have made some influence.
Yes. Oh, yes.
In his reality, I mean.
Yes, in his personal reality.
Yeah.
I think he probably did believe in evil spirits, but he didn't write it down. And I say that because it's sort of implicit in the Red Book. Because, as I said earlier, Jung did believe, although it's implicit, but later writers have pointed it out, that some of the characters that he worked with in his deep imagination and wrote about in the Red Book, he believed that they were the spirits of actual dead people. So he believed in the reality of spirits. So logically, he would believe in the reality of evil spirits. He just never said so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he himself had an out-of-body experience.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry, your sound is not very clear.
He had a near-death experience which led to an out-of-body experience.
Yes, that's right, when he had a heart attack, I think, didn't he?
Yes.
Yep. Well, there is in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in the chapter called Life After Death, he recounts that experience. He describes that experience, and he also describes some hints about life after death that he received from patients of his, their dreams and so forth. It's an interesting chapter to read, I think.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yes.
Just as I was listening to you talk about the idea of the blockages.
Yeah.
Swedenborg talks a lot about the idea of influx of and the way you were just talking about the light switch and the power, and that's very in keeping with how he talks about influx.
All right.
And that the idea of evil is the absence of good or love, which just it reminded me of when it seemed to link in with the idea of the blockage concept. It's the absence of.
Yes.
So a couple of questions. Yeah, a couple of questions I have. As Swedenborg talks about the way you were describing the ego seems very much in keeping with the word he uses called the proprium, which is the sense of self. And he talks about a hellish proprium, which is based on believing everything that is real is what it can see and touch in this world, and then the heavenly proprium being the self that is the real self, if you like. Does Jung talk about a new ego being formed, or is it just more about connecting with the self?
It's more about
that would rule over that ego.
Yeah, no, it's more about connecting with the self.
And the self then.
The idea of a new ego being formed. No.
Yeah.
The ego can be transformed by connecting with the self.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Which I guess in practice is like a new ego, because it's operating from a different that's very similar to the way Swedenborg kind of speaks about the new natural mind, he calls it. It's like the lower level of the mind, which would be the awareness, which would be the ego kind of thing. The other question I had was about visions.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how he had his visions? Were they from meditation, or were they from waking sleep, or that vision that he had, for example, the prophetic one of the World War II? Yeah, I'm just curious.
That was a vision. I think that just came to him spontaneously. As far as I understand it, his description of it.
Do you have a particular practice of meditation?
No, he was sitting in a train.
Okay. Yeah.
So, my fantasy is he was sitting in a train, staring out a window and the vision started.
Yeah.
Happened to
Well,
him.
That's good. That fits in more with my experiences of visions.
Okay.
Mm.
You describe remote viewing in doing that, looking out the window of a train, for example. Remote viewing is described precisely like that.
Mm. I didn't get the remote viewing.
Remote viewing.
Remote viewing. Ah, okay.
Yes.
Look, I'm really sorry. I'm not understanding you very well, but I did get that one.
Okay.
Remote viewing. Okay, now I'm going to write that down.
Where's that from? Remote viewing.
Well, basically it's from New Age teachings. A lot of people are doing it and able to do it. And they simply put themselves in a now state, and visions simply unfold in front of their eyes. It's as though it's actually happened. They're very much like Jung's experience.
And
Yeah.
the military tried to do it for espionage purposes.
That's right. The military tried to weaponize it
Oh, right.
by training specific soldiers to practice it, to see where munitions were hidden by the enemy and all sorts of things. But basically they tried to weaponize it. But
Yes.
that's the military for you.
Mm. Mm.
But that shows you how seriously remote viewing is now being taken by the hierarchy.
Yes.
Run
Yeah.
this world. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, when you mentioned about...
Sorry, could I just finish with Sarah first, please?
Certainly.
I just wanted to say that you were asking about visions. Jung developed something he called active imagination, which is a phrase I think that Swedenborg also uses. But it's about getting down into a deep meditative state. So you contact the deep imagination, not just fantasies about how I'm going to win a beauty contest. He would say, start by visualizing one of the characters he'd been working with and ask them a question, and then wait for a response to come from the unconscious. Now it's, he became very good at that, and you know, it would continue on for a long time. And he wrote down the dialogues that he had with some of these characters in the Red Book. But that was an active process. It wasn't a vision that just came to him, as with the vision on the train.
Yeah.
He did it deliberately.
So he did it consciously.
Yes.
To explore his own psyche, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. All right. So sorry. Your name is Ona, and I interrupted you. You had a question or a comment, I think.
Oh, that's okay. When you mentioned about the self having a blueprint,
Yes.
that's already been set apparently, and it tries to influence the person to go closer to that blueprint.
Yes.
Is that some sort of predetermination? Did Jung believe in predetermination?
Yes, it is some sort of, I think it is some sort of predetermination. In a very abstract way, and there's a great deal of free will involved in that. We don't have to listen to the promptings of the self. I mean, at our own peril, I would say, but we don't have to. It's not, you know, that you are robotically directed to become individuated or to become this sort of person. But, and of course, you know, to say a blueprint, it's a metaphor, really. You can never know whether there is a blueprint. You can never know whether self exists. It can only ever be a hypothesis, obviously.
Yeah.
But that was Jung's experience of both himself and of the very many people he worked with, that there was some factor sort of guiding one's development
Thanks.
towards a greater inner harmony.
If there's no other questions, I've got one. I noticed on your diagram the anima and the animus. Could you briefly talk about those?
Oh, I was afraid you'd ask.
Is that a subject for another time, perhaps?
Well, yes, they're somewhat difficult concepts. And there's been a lot of debate down the years about them. So the basic idea is that men have an unconscious feminine side and women have an unconscious masculine side. The men's unconscious feminine side is the anima, and the women's unconscious masculine side is the animus. First of all, I think these days, with our greater sophistication in our understanding of gender, we would not simply make it bipolar, binary, would we? So Jung's idea of animus and anima was based on binary gender images.
Swedenborg also is very strong in the binary idea as well.
Yes, yes. So, you know, already that goes out the window. Jung suggested that anima was man's soul, the archetype of life, the life of the soul. But animus was not women's soul. He even asks, he's very, very negative about animus. He even asks in volume 9, habet mulier animam, does woman have a soul? He doesn't answer the question. But he doesn't say anything nice about women's animus, which gets my animus going no end.
What does he mean? He doesn't think women have a soul?
Well, he doesn't answer it, but he doesn't say anything positive about animus either. So draw your own conclusions.
Oh, it's just reflective of his own process, I'd say.
I reckon.
Yeah, we've got another question here.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a series of comments. I mean, first of all,
I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Let me say. Supposing this is a supplementary point. Now, if for a woman, Jung does not want to say anything nice about the animus, that is actually a critique of the masculine aspect, not a feminine aspect.
Yeah.
That's just a supplementary
Sorry,
point.
if a woman can't say anything nice about anima.
So let's say so in the case of the woman's soul, it will have to be the animus, which is the male side.
Yes.
So actually saying something bad about the male in that case, not female.
saying something bad about the male
Yes,
through her animus.
yes.
Yes. What?
No, the
Sorry,
point,
I don't know what the question is.
it was a comment. All right, don't worry about it. Let's ignore it.
I'm really sorry. It's so hard to hear you.
Yeah, okay.
I think he means it's more of a comment on Jung's masculine identification with his own soul. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Because, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For some reason, Sarah, you're much clearer. I don't know why.
I'm in my own screen at home and they're in one screen. So
Yes, yes.
Let us go back to the picture of that structure of the
Yes, of the psyche.
yeah.
Right. I've got to share this. Oh, come along. Share the screen. Share. And
Now, a couple of things, a good place to start. Now, remember this picture and let us go back to that picture, please.
this one.
Yes. Now, just going back, these complexes, where do they live in this picture? Are they in the shadow, or is that different?
Sorry, go on.
And well, the other one, I mean, as for in this picture, the anima and the animus go directly into the ego, bypassing the shadow.
They can.
Go
Yes.
through the shadow too. So I'm just trying to see in terms of the complexes,
Yes.
where would they fit in this picture, please?
Complexes are in the unconscious mostly.
In the shadow.
Unless you particularly try to observe yourself and pull them out of the unconscious and try and make them conscious, which of course is a way of weakening them and resolving them. So I
Are
put
they in the shadow?
complexes usually below the dotted line in the personal unconscious.
Are they in the shadow, Annette?
Yes, they can be. But if I have a very positive complex, it'll be in the unconscious, but it won't be in shadow.
So you mentioned the affection for a fox terrier, for example, that
Yeah.
wouldn't be in the shadow. That would be in the wider, broader personal one.
Yes, wider, broader shadow, right, unconscious, but not particularly in the shadow.
Yes, okay.
Thank you. That brings me to my last point. In light of Swedenborg, now with Swedenborg, I feel that this map actually mirrors on the other side. So here you have a personal unconscious, a collective unconscious, but the mirror side of this will be the God self and the divine, whatever, the unconscious. And for Swedenborg, it's as though there are this heaven and hell pulling us, one in one direction and the other in the other direction, and we are in equilibrium somewhere in the middle. This whole diagram can be mirrored as well.
Yeah. And I think Swedenborg would actually, the way Swedenborg would present this is to put that self at the top.
But there could be a bad self also, so we still need one at the bottom.
Yes,
but we need the good self still at the top.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean, yes. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, putting it down the bottom doesn't mean it's in hell or negative. It was
It's depth.
just to show depth rather than negativity. If that makes sense.
So would God be down there with the self?
Yes.
It is the self synonymous with God?
I think Jung avoided saying yes to that question for reasons of of his professional reputation.
My
But it is implicit in some of his writing that the self is synonymous with God, yes.
my sense
Or
of
you
it
could say divine energies come through the self. But it comes to the same thing, Wayne, doesn't it?
Well, get into big theological discussions whether, if you can become, if that's yourself and it is God and you becoming God, well.
Oh, no, you don't become yourself. You never become the self. You never become that completely. You just get a bit closer to it.
So that's not you then. That's not your self, small
Define
s self, as opposed to capital S self.
Mm.
Where is our ordinary self compared to?
Ego identity.
And that's what it is.
I'd say, well, the small s self would be pretty much our ego identity, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Mm. What we have awareness of.
Yes, or awareness of. And I think it would be partly in the ego and partly in the personal unconscious. But the self is transpersonal. We can never become the self, just as we can never become God.
Mm.
Well, Swedenborg asked the question, who is God? And then he answered it by saying, God is your very self.
Yeah, so Swedenborg would probably call the self the infinite and the omnipotent, and then we are the finite that has a finite perception of that.
Yeah.
What you've mentioned, Annette, is the word soul, and I see the word soul in that self as you've spoken of it. But you talk about it turning in two directions. One was towards the divine as the reception of life, and then the other was towards the ego and the unconscious to the conscious and passing that energy through. So that for me is the soul that Swedenborg describes. You're quite right. Again, we don't become that soul, and through what Swedenborg calls regeneration, we tend towards it, but we can tend towards perfection, but we'll never get there.
Yes, exactly.
All very, very similar, I think.
Yeah, yes. But every step along the way bears fruit. Every step along the way is worth taking.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, I must make one last point, or maybe not. I hope last. The way this diagram is drawn, and it probably is correct. This collective unconscious has an overbearing, almost suffocating effect on the ego. Individuation becomes the hardest possible thing to do, because you're always drowned in this collective unconscious. And
if you are drowned in the collective unconscious, you are psychotic. Because if you are drowned in the collective unconscious, you have no reality function. The ego's reality function has ceased to work, and you are completely controlled by the collective images, and you are psychotic. You've lost touch with reality.
Meaning that I cannot order my thoughts in some manner. That's right,
because you need the ego to order your thoughts.
So it doesn't mean that the collective unconscious disappears, I think, but it is under control. I suppose that's perhaps the way to do it. The influence is there. It's the same way Swedenborg talks about thought as, you know, flowing into us from our spiritual environment, but we're not controlled by the thought. So I might have a thought of, I think I'm going to go down the road and, you know, steal something from a local shop. Doesn't mean I have to do it. So the influence is still potentially there, but I am able to control and choose which influence I accept and which influence I reject. So
Yes.
yeah, I think that's how I see that.
Yeah. And the thing that does the choosing is the ego.
Yeah.
The individuation, I think you were just saying it's quite a hard thing. Is that what you were saying?
Not necessarily hard. No, not necessarily. It just is something that we need to pay attention to. That we need to pay attention to, you know, the intuitions that we have, or the thoughts or the understandings that we develop. It's not hard and effortful. It happens it happens to us. What we need to do is not block it, but to accept it.
I think that with individuation, we all get whatever we think from other people. Like we get opinions from other people, we get thoughts from other people, and we sort of select which ones we want to agree with and to keep.
Yes.
So in that way, there's no individuation because we get everything from everyone else. But I think where the individuation comes in is we each are a unique combination of certain interests. Like one person could be interested in music and a particular sport or whatever, mathematics, you know, and so that's where the individuation comes in. The combination of certain interests and knowledges, you know, that's unique.
Yes.
To a person.
Yes. And interests, yes, which also tend to develop us. That certainly if I have an interest in mathematics, so I will no doubt develop a logical mind, and also one hopes put it to use.
Yeah.
In some way.
Well, so I'll just say it's approaching 9 o'clock. Are there any last minute questions before we round off for the evening?
I'm still very fascinated by this idea that Jung might have said that women don't have a soul. I'd like to look. Well,
he left the question unanswered, Sarah, and that I think, as I say, that arouses my animus no end. But
it comes to the
he didn't say women don't have a soul. He did not say that. He just didn't answer the question.
He didn't answer the question, but he definitively answered that the anima is man's soul.
Yes.
So is there a general theory then that he wasn't sure about the women's soul?
Well, I think people politely passed over it and pretend he didn't write that particular paragraph. But as a feminist, I couldn't do that.
I was just wondering if I can go read it or if I can go whereabouts.
It's Collected Works, Volume 9, part 1. And I think there's sections on anima and animus and ego and whatnot.
It brings to mind the image of the Adam and Eve story, the fact that she was created out of his rib.
Yeah, it's real patriarchal, sexist horrors.
But I mean, Swedenborg writes about that in a particularly spiritual process kind of way. So
yeah,
I'm just wondering, they probably correlate with each other in that sense. So there might be something to that. Interesting to look at it.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
Well, can I say thank you, Annette, for your presentation for us this evening. I found it fascinating. I knew a little bit about Jung and his psychology, and I've learned a lot tonight, which I've very much appreciated. So thank you for everything you've presented to us this evening, and I hope everybody else has enjoyed it. I think so, from what I gather. So very much appreciated having you with us. I'll just mention before we go, we don't actually have a meeting next month, but we will be meeting again at the end of October, and our presenter at that time will be Kim Bentley. Now, he's a local member of our group here, and he's written a book called An Introduction to Spirituality, which he'll be sharing with us in 2 months' time, at the end of October. We'll send that information out through the usual channels, and if you're, I'm sure it'll be really interested to hear what Kim has to say. But look, again, thank you, Annette, for everything you presented for us this evening. Found it fascinating, and hopefully we can get you back again sometime.
Not to talk about animus, please.
All right.
It's been a great pleasure, and I've really enjoyed doing that. I'm not just saying that to be nice, but really has been very interesting to discover this dimension of Jung that I hadn't fully known before. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much again. I wish you everybody a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.